Joining me is our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert. Good morning, Doug.
Good morning.
Now, the Bogota meeting came after opposition supporters failed at this weekend to let in this humanitarian aid, despite all their best promises. Are they likely to try again? And, is there another plan in the offing?
For the first part of that question, are they likely to try again? The easy answer, the short answer is no. There's no immediate plan to try to redeliver that aid. The Colombian President Ivan Duque himself has said it will remain stored in warehouses where it had been before this attempt to block it. And you're right that Nicolas Maduro is pointing to what he sees as this failed attempt to get any significant amounts of aid through as sort of the end of what he sees as the coup against him. He says the momentum of this coup is essentially over. That's his government's line. So he sees it as a big setback for the opposition. Now, the opposition is trying to sort of, regroup itself, in a sense. And, they're looking for a plan B, because there isn't really a plan B right now. Military intervention is sort of alluded to everywhere. It's on everyone's lips. But no one is explicitly calling for it for now. What we do have is a very heavy-handed, aggressive, American-backed campaign, which can really only be dubbed a campaign at regime change. What have we had coming out of Bogota? We've had basically Mike Pence leading the charge here, spearheading the charge, ramping up pressure on what he calls bystanders, countries in the region which have so far stood on the sidelines remain neutral, notably Mexico and Uruguay, saying you can't remain neutral, you can't be bystanders, you have to join this effort. So it's a very heavy-handed campaign to pressure people to join that effort at regime change. The words regime change are not used, obviously. Sanctions, new sanctions. On top of the sanctions against the state oil company, now new sanctions targeting 4 Venezuelan governors, their assets, governors tied to the government of Nicolas Maduro. And on top of that, more aid, $56 million more in humanitarian aid. So for now, not military intervention, but more sanctions, more financial pressure, more political pressure on the bystanders, so-called bystanders, to come in, and a lot of American heavy-handedness here in trying to lead that charge, obviously in consort with Juan Guaido.
Now, military aid, as you said, has been hinted at. We had Juan Guaido who sort of said the international community needs to use all means necessary to get rid of Nicolas Maduro. But few are openly calling for it. Some in the opposition actually don't want it.
They're just the contrary, exactly. What is the formulation we constantly hear? All options on the table. All options on the table is what? Is not so diplomatic shorthand for military intervention, right? That they're not ruling it out. Donald Trump has said it. I believe Mike Pence has used the exact same phrase. Juan Guaido has essentially said the same thing without using the terms military intervention. I want to show you, though, you're absolutely right. There are, the EU notably, and some countries within the European Union that have recognized Juan Guaido as a legitimate president, have been calling for free elections, are notably against military action. The EU issued a statement saying no military intervention. We want what they call a peaceful, democratic, Venezuelan-owned solution to a Venezuelan crisis. They don't want this so-called throwback to the U.S. Monroe Doctrine, which was a doctrine which said if it's in the U.S.'s backyard, the U.S. has some empirical right to dictate the terms, even if that means imposing regime change. I want to just quickly show you a quote from the Spanish Foreign Minister, Josep Borrell. This is interesting because what he said, and Spain is a country that basically supports a democratic opposition. Not every option's on the table. We have clearly warned we'd not support, would roundly condemn any foreign military intervention, something we hope won't happen. The solution in Venezuela can only be reached through a democratic solution agreed by Venezuelans and the calling of presidential elections. So that's essentially echoing exactly what the EU is saying. Brazil, meanwhile, right? Brazil, one of the countries from which this aid was trying to flow through to Venezuela, it has ruled out any prospect of military intervention if it would be from its territory. Okay,
that's interesting because it is neighboring Venezuela.
Absolutely.
Now, Guaido and his allies have been hoping to see mass defections from the military. Since this weekend, we've seen figures fluctuate, but we've seen between 60 to 160 defect. Could that be the tipping point to something more to come?
Well, Juan Guaido certainly hopes so. Now, look, he didn't see that critical mass, perhaps, that in the military, defecting to the other side, to the opposition in droves this weekend. Perhaps the opposition had been hoping for that all these military that have been guarding the bridges, blocking the aid from getting through, would hear the appeals of the opposition, would somehow sort of bend, and somehow would all of a sudden cross over to the other side, and that would be the end. The opposition would be in power. Maduro would have effectively be toppled. That has not happened. The figures do fluctuate from the several dozen. The government of Nicolas Maduro says it's nothing, a drop in the bucket, maybe 2022. We've heard figures of about 160. I've even heard and seen figures as high as 440. What we do know is these tend to be so far the lower-ranking soldiers, soldiers whose families, whose friends, whose relatives are feeling the same injurious effects of the economic collapse in Venezuela, the food and medicine shortages, as everyone else, as those in the opposition appealing to them. What we haven't seen so far, still with a very few exceptions, is the top military brass crossing to the other side. Nicolas Maduro still has them very firmly, it seems, under his thumb. Whether there's a tipping point, what will it take for something to tip and everyone else say, now's the time I can cross or will cross? Who knows? But for now, he has the military, and for now, he seems to have a little bit of spring in his step, he being Nicolas Maduro, because he's kept the military on side.
Indeed. Douglas, thank you very much for that. Douglas Herbert there with today's Global Grid.